Hello everybody and welcome back to the Grim Dawn Newcomer's Guide. Today we're going to continue our mini-series on characters with the Demolitionist class. This is the second class we're using in gameplay going on in the background and is probably one of my favorites simply because of all the fire. Demolitionist is an extremely high DPS class with a large focus on fire, lightning, and chaos damage, and this class also has some really cool utility abilities for more creative build making. So, this class coupled with the Soldier is going to give you your Commando, which is what we are rocking in the current playthrough on your screen, and I love it. Now, it is a YouTube video, so feel free to like, comment, subscribe your heart out, and we can hop into the Demolitionist Deep Dive video. Now, in the same pattern as the Soldier video, we'll start with the active abilities and move on to the passive abilities towards the end. So that said, let's start off with our first active ability in the same vein as Cadence. That is going to be Fire Strike. Fire Strike is an auto attack modifier with a huge mastery tree that will take you all the way to the end of your skill tree, actually. To begin with, though, Fire Strike will take your weapon damage, buff your physical damage, and add some flat fire damage to all of your auto attacks. Since it's using your weapon damage, Fire Strike will always scale relatively well as long as you have a strong weapon, which most builds that are melee focused or auto focused will. Since it's a little bit early on in the build tree, I think it can get overlooked a little bit, but it is extremely good, and with all of the masteries along the tree, the ability is going to be really helpful throughout all stages of the game. Now, we really start to take off on this ability when we start putting points into the next mastery, which is Explosive Strike. Explosive Strike is going to add a small amount of weapon damage. It's going to add physical and burn damage on top of that, but the real kicker for this mastery is going to be the ability to give your auto attacks an AoE radius that caps at 3.8 meters at level 12. So for reference, that's larger than the baseline Blackwater Cocktail radius, which is pretty thick on its own. But at the next junction on the tree, you can opt for more damage in two ways. You can either choose Searing Might, which is going to give you more crit damage and more total damage modification. But if you are hurting for energy in your Demolitionist builds, which is not uncommon, Searing Strike will give you a boost to Searing Strike. Searing Might is the first one, Searing Strike is the other one. Will give you boosts to crit and total damage in a smaller fashion, but will also reduce the energy cost of Fire Strike by about a third. That might not seem like much now because the energy cost is pretty low, but the more points you put into Fire Strike and the masteries down the line, the more energy that you're going to eat with each swing. So speaking of down the line, our next mastery is going to be Static Strike. And this is the first mastery in the line that will increase the cost of your attacks, but on top of the fire damage it's giving you, you're also going to get a pretty high chance to rain down some lightning damage, as well as the ability to knock down enemies. With just autos, that's pretty good. Couple that with our Explosive Strike, and you can see how nuts this ability gets in a big AoE. Then finally, the last mastery on the tree is called Brimstone. Brimstone is actually going to make your attacks splinter, and then the number of points in the ability will dictate the amount of splinters. There can be up to 7 splinters per auto attack at max rank, but the splinters themselves will be doing fire and chaos damage. So, just imagine for a second that your autos are all dumping their own damage, and then every time that they hit, they're spooting out smaller, even more damaging attacks in every direction. It's a massive AoE clear, and with a little bit of attack speed, you can literally tear through the fabric of reality. So now that we've completed our first ability, that whole thing was just one active ability for the Demolitionist. Let's move on to number 2, which is going to have even more mastery options. Not more, but just as many, we'll say. Blackwater Cocktail is actually my favorite ability in the Demo class because the huge circular carpet of fire will match any living room, kitchen, or dining set for all of your entertaining needs. This ability is going to be doing some fire and burn damage, which is really nice. It's a pretty small amount of damage, but the real reason that I end up picking this ability is the reduction to the offensive ability on enemies that are hit by it. It's actually disgusting how hard you are to hit inside of a Blackwater Cocktail. If you're building a tanky class with your Demolitionist, I'd highly recommend this ability, which is what we're doing with our Commando on the screen here. So you'll see, as long as the Blackwater Cocktail actually lands where I want it to, it is super useful. Then if you add in the first mastery called High Potency, you're going to be increasing the radius of the Blackwater Cocktail, extending the duration, and slowing the enemy attacks, all while giving you a total 165% modified damage. So you are going to extremely increase the damage of the ability while extending the duration, increasing the radius, and then slowing down enemies who are attacking you while also reducing their offensive ability. So they're going to hit you slower, and then they may not even have a chance to hit you, period. So they have even fewer options to hit you, which is great. Really good. Now, the second mastery for this ability is going to lean a bit harder into damage for Cocktail, but it will also go so far as to reduce the enemy damage by up to 15%. So Demon Fire is, for all intents and purposes, making tanks more tanky. The last notch of the tree, what was that? That was a weird graphical error. I wonder if that was lighting going on. Weird. Anyway, where were we? Oh yeah, the last notch on the tree being Agonizing Flames. Agonizing Flames is going to be pure damage increase to both your fire and chaos damage, while also reducing enemy resistances by up to 25%. Personally, in the build that I'm rocking right now, Agonizing Flames isn't necessary, but it's also not going to break the game if you want to have a bit of fun with it. My suggestion is that if you are taking your Hellfire Mines, don't worry too much about Agonizing Flames, because really they'll overlap on the utility part of stuff, so not a huge deal. Active number 3 is called Stunjacks, and may be the most unassuming ability that exists in the whole Demolitionist kit. Now, I don't take this ability super often, but I'm starting to rethink that in a couple builds. Stunjacks deal damage per jack, so what might look like a small amount of damage up front can actually be multiplied 3 times, and depending on the masteries that you take, up to 6 times. So the tooltip itself will tell you that the damage and the stats of 1 jack, and then if you end up throwing the ability, you'll throw 3. So if you... basically, Stunjacks will let you shotgun the jacks at point-blank range for big damage. So since we haven't even touched on the stun part of Stunjacks, we can talk about that a little bit, but there's not really much to say beyond it. It stuns people, it's super cool, and with the amount of damage that they can do very close up, that stun will couple extremely well. There's actually a character in Act 2 that is a little bit of an optional enemy that hardcore players are absolutely terrified of, because all he does is throw Stunjacks at you, and if you get hit by any of them, it is really easy to die. So it's disgusting and probably needs to be picked more often. But the first mastery on the Stunjack tree is called Quickjacks, and you can pick that up for less damage, but you will double the stun duration on the Stunjacks and remove the cooldown entirely. So you can spam Stunjacks, deal lots of CC, but maybe a little bit less damage. Now, obviously, CC is going to have enemies that are completely resistant to it, so, you know, bosses are going to be a little bit more of a pain for a Stunjack player, but it's not the worst thing in the world, because you can go even further and take Full Spread. Full Spread is actually going to increase the number of jacks that you can throw while adding both trauma and electrocute damage to the ability itself. It's also going to buff your physical and lightning damage, making this ability basically a pocket nuke from point blank range. It's awesome. Now, your next ability is a defensive and utility option we're going to call Flashbang, and as the name implies, it is going to flash and then bang enemies. Just, you know, not in the cool way. Flashbang comes with a chance to confuse enemies into hitting each other, but also has a pretty massive reduction in defensive ability with a huge radius. If you have a devotion skill that activates nicely off of AoE, I'd put Flashbang up there with the best of abilities in terms of activation. Searing Light, which is the one and only mastery for Flashbang, will dig deeper into the utility of the skill and slow enemies that are hit, with a chance to both fumble, which is a silence, and impair aim, which is a blind. So that translates roughly to, I think it's anywhere from like 30 to 40% chance to silence and blind enemies who get hit with Flashbang. And Flashbang does not have, it either has a 1 second cooldown or no cooldown at all, but you can basically spam Flashbang pretty consistently. Next up is another grenade-based ability called Granado. Granado is actually a tremendously powerful ability and one of the strongest in the entire Demolitionist kit. It's not something that we're using in the Commando build. I am thinking my life decisions over right now in this moment because I said that, because it's a grenade, it's a Commando. It just makes sense. But not only is the cooldown super short on Granado for 4 seconds, it's either 3 or 4 seconds, one of the two, but the damage variety is off the charts once you actually start adding some points into the later masteries. Granado baseline, though, is going to almost constantly knock down enemies, and at max rank, will always knock them down. So there's a chance at your base rank to knock them down, and then at max rank, they're going to fall down no matter what. And if you opt for Skyfire Granado, the first up on the mastery tree, you'll end up converting all of your physical damage into lightning damage for your Granado, and that's it. You just have a lightning grenade, and that isn't bad, especially if you're leaning into that lightning damage type for your Demolitionist. Now, High Impact is the next mastery in the tree and will bump your physical and trauma damage all the way into space, while adding some flat fire damage to the ability as well, making the Granado even more explosive. Shattering Blast will round out the Granado tree by adding crit damage, retaliation damage added to attack, pierce damage, fire damage, and flat trauma damage. If you couldn't get behind a 3-second explosive device to begin with, maybe a 3-second planetary collision will change your mind. And our final grenade-like ability is called Canister Bomb. This ability is cool in that once it is cast, it will explode again into smaller exploders, each dealing fire, burn, and piercing damage. Sadly, you can't use this ability the same way that you can use stun jacks because the little poofs that come out always spread out. So Concussive Bomb is a little bit disappointing in that manner, but, you know, it's still got its own uses. The first mastery for Concussive Bomb is going to give you a small chance for a small stun as well, and it will convert your physical damage to lightning. So it's not super impressive, but it does exist, and with the amount of area that Concussive Bomb covers when it has exploded, that small stun chance is pretty open. Now, if you were rocking the Skyfire Granado, this might also couple well with that. So you could have the Concussive Bomb and the grenades both dealing lightning damage and, you know, really push it to the limit on those lightning demo builds. And you can take that even a step further with improved casing, which is going to increase the radius of the ability while buffing all of your damage types and getting you some additional flat trauma damage. So really, all of the grenade abilities in the kit for the Demolitionist are pretty varied in damage in terms of, well, I use varied loosely because there's about 1 million damage types in Grim Dawn, but you can see what I'm talking about. Your next two abilities are actually considered summons by the game, and I can get behind that in definition, but they do scale from player bonuses rather than pet bonuses. Thermite Mine is the first, and this ability is literally just columns of screaming hot death that shoot upward from the ground. Thermite Mine lives for 12 seconds and spawns 3 mines at a time, meaning you can cast it twice, and then you're going to hit the summon cap for it. But that is actually 6 mines on the ground, and they'll decide where that they want to be placed. The mines themselves deal fire and burn damage, but even better than that, they reduce elemental resistance. So, they're already increasing the amount of damage that they do, all by their lonesome. And then once you get up to the Hellfire Mine tier, you can take the resistance shredding a step further by pulling Aether and Chaos resistance off of your enemies, while adding some flat Chaos damage and buffing both your fire and burn damage again. Now, all in all, it's a super strong ability, and I would highly recommend it, especially for melee or tanky-focused Demolitionist builds, because you can lay these bad boys down, have a whole bunch of people run at you, and they will just walk into the death fields. It is nuts, and it's the whole reason that we're using both Warcry and Hellfire Mine with the Commando build we're rocking right now. Not only that, but it's really good at helping take down bosses. Because they live for so long, the bosses, typically the big boys, don't move. So you can just leave the mines underneath them, shred resistances, and let them do their thing until they run out. Put another one down, and that was the whole... I mean, basically that whole Logorian fight, we had Hellfire Mines on the ground. There was not a point in time where the ground was not covered in fire. Now, the second quote-unquote summon for the Demolitionist is Mortar Trap, and this will quite literally lay down a self-firing mortar. The Mortar Trap can't be killed, it doesn't have a health bar, and it's just going to launch bombs that deal physical and fire damage in a pretty nice-sized AoE. Grabbing Heavy Ordnance, which is the next mastery, will give you a chance to stun, add some flat lightning damage, and buff your fire and physical damage. So that's also going to increase the AoE with the ability, increase the AoE in which the ability does damage. And then the last mastery for the Mortar Trap is called the Big One. Aptly named, very cool. And I don't think you need a reason other than the title to pick this. The mastery is going to add flat damage to your fire, physical, and burn damage, but it's also going to increase both the target radius, so the AoE in which the Mortar Trap will look for targets, as well as the AoE in which the actual projectile explodes. And both of those are going to get increased substantially, so your mortar can get put all over the place and still hit enemies. Add a slow on top of everything else, and you now have a monstrous mortar for maiming monsters. It's awesome. I don't know if I need to tell you that, but basically everything we've talked about up to this point, with the exception of maybe Canister Bomb, is awesome in the Demolitionist kit. Now, on the passive side of things, the Demolitionist has fewer than the Soldier, but still enough to offer some really strong options. So your first passive is called Flame Touched, which is an aura ability that provides buffs to lightning, fire, and their damage over time counterparts, which would be electrocute and burn. You also get a big chunk of offensive ability and some flat fire damage for your troubles, and it's a very strong ability for auto-based builds. If you add Temper, which is the first mastery to the mix, you'll get yourself a large chunk of defensive ability on top of trauma, physical, and piercing buffs. Temper adds even more flat physical damage as well, while buffing your retaliation damage super high. So this is just a passive aura. You're going to toggle this on, and all those stats suddenly become yours. Blast Shield is your next passive that we're going to talk about, and it doesn't require that you have a shield, despite the way the name is written. It operates a little bit like Menhir's Will, actually, but it does give you very different stats on activation. And then the shield part of Blast Shield is actually a damage absorption shield that kicks in to take damage left over from your armor absorption and other defensive stats, and can get pretty high at max rank. On top of that, Blast Shield is giving you increases to maximum resistances, which will take you over the 80% cap, and buffing your pierce and elemental resistances. Lastly, Blast Shield is going to give you some flat fire retaliation damage, which is going to make hitting you even less pleasant for the bad guys. And then the next passive is called Vindictive Flame. Super early accessible, but just like an X from a bad breakup, this ability will set people on fire while laughing maniacally at the carnage. Vindictive Flame is actually going to synergize really well with Black Shield, and really any retaliation focused build would work well with Vindictive Flame. This ability works on an aura, but the effect has a short cooldown. So when you're hit, Vindictive Flame will shoot out a circular AoE, dealing both physical and fire damage while also having a chance at stunning the attackers. And then, to add to that, you're also getting health regen, increased total speed, and fire retaliation damage just from toggling the ability on. So it comes with an active component and a passive component, which is awesome. With all the stats that this bad boy, you'd assume that there would be no need to give it more, but you'd be wrong. Enter Ulzwin's Wrath. The only mastery for this ability, Ulzwin's Wrath, is actually going to affect the active effect of Vindictive Flame. So on top of the AoE fire damage we get, we're also getting lightning arcs outward from our character as well. These lightning arcs are going to add retaliation damage to your attack with fire, lightning, and electrocute damage. You'll also have a strong chance to knock down on those attacks, reduce the damage of enemies, and then go on to convert a percentage of this damage to health. It's kind of nuts, but mostly insane, and you get it super early on in your build. So depending on how you're playing your character, it's almost a must pick. And then we can move on to the very last passive ability, which is Ulzwin's Chosen. Ulzwin's Chosen is actually going to affect 3 of your abilities, and you have to have at least one of them to even pick it. Those abilities being Stunjacks, Granado, and Canister Bomb. Ulzwin's Chosen is going to reduce the energy cost of these abilities, modify their total damage, and most fun of all, give you a chance to completely reset the cooldown of the button that you just pressed. So imagine, just for a moment, a little lucky streak in which you throw 4 Granado pocket nukes at a freshly spawned monster shrine. Suddenly there's no more monster shrine. It's also not an exclusive skill, so you don't have to worry about it conflicting with your other classes. It is literally pure profit if you're building one of those abilities. So, we're actually getting towards the mid-game with this build, so you may actually see me pick up some of those abilities as the game continues on. Haven't super decided yet. All I know is that we're not keeping Force Wave, and that'll be going out soon. So really, we've got some decisions to make coming up here. But that is going to do it for this video today, guys. This is the Tomb of Ugdal, though. If you haven't happened upon this in your own playthrough, you can get yourself an ethereal missive here from Ugdal if you trade him a Wendigo spirit. I have never actually tried to kill him because I think he's just, you know, lonely guy trapped in a thing and he's a ghost, and that's crazy. But anyway, peace out.